The morning sun spilled over the skyline like liquid gold, drenching the glass towers of downtown in a glow that promised opportunity. Beneath that light, Amira Johnson stood on the edge of her new beginning. She had just graduated top of her class, mechanical engineering, honors, distinction, every achievement earned with nights of struggle and a heart that never gave up. Her dream had always been simple: to build something that mattered, machines, systems, innovations that could make life better for people who rarely saw themselves represented in boardrooms or on company walls. When she received the interview call from Keller Dynamics, one of the biggest engineering firms in the country, she thought fate was finally being kind. It was the type of company whose name carried power, wealth, and influence. A company that could turn careers into legends. That morning, Amira's mother pressed the creases of her only formal blazer, whispering words of pride and prayer. Amira smiled, promised she'd make her proud, and stepped into a world that didn't always welcome people who looked like her, but one she was ready to conquer. The lobby of Keller Dynamics was a cathedral of ambition. Marble floors, chrome pillars, and screens flashing the company's slogan, "Innovation with Integrity." Everyone moved with a sense of self-importance, their polished shoes and designer suits marking them as part of an inner circle. Amira felt their eyes as she walked through, curious, assessing, and in some cases, dismissive. Her natural curls framed her face. Her dark skin glowed softly under the cold light. She carried herself with quiet confidence, but to some, she was already out of place. When she was led into the interview room, the air shifted. The panel of 3 executives greeted her with polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. At the center sat Martin Keller, the CEO himself, silver-haired, sharp, the kind of man whose authority filled the room. He skimmed her resume with raised brows, then leaned back in his chair. Amira answered every question with poise and precision. Her technical expertise was undeniable. Her ideas were innovative, her vision bold. But as the interview went on, she could feel something invisible pressing against her, a wall she couldn't quite name. There were glances exchanged between the executives, small, almost imperceptible smirks when she spoke of leadership or her long-term goals. Keller's tone shifted from professional curiosity to veiled condescension. He asked her about cultural fit, about whether she'd be comfortable in a highly competitive traditional environment. By the time she walked out, Amira's confidence was mixed with uncertainty. Still, she hoped her work would speak louder than their biases. 2 weeks later, the offer came. She had done it. Keller Dynamics wanted her as a junior design engineer. Her mother cried tears of joy, her friends cheered, and for the first time, Amira allowed herself to dream without fear. The first few months were a blur of hard work. She arrived early, stayed late, and quickly became known for her creativity and dedication. Yet, there was always a quiet tension in the air, the kind that lingered when she entered meeting rooms or shared ideas that others took credit for moments later. Her colleagues smiled to her face, but their words were often laced with subtle dismissal. She was impressive for her background, articulate, a great diversity hire. Each phrase chipped away at something inside her, even as she forced herself to stay professional. Keller, the CEO, rarely spoke to her directly, but when he did, it was with the kind of patronizing tone that made her stomach tighten. He saw her not as an equal or a potential leader, but as a symbol, something to point at when the company needed to appear inclusive. Then came the project that changed everything. Keller Dynamics had landed a massive government contract for a renewable energy system. It was the kind of project that could reshape the company's legacy. Amira's team was assigned to design a crucial component, the energy conversion module. She threw herself into the work, pouring every ounce of her knowledge and creativity into finding a solution that would outperform the competition. For weeks, she stayed late, perfecting every line of code, every design schematic. When the final presentation came, her prototype outperformed every other team's design by a wide margin. Her supervisor, a middle-aged man named Clark, congratulated her in private. Then, in the final board presentation, presented the design as his own. Amira sat at the end of the long table as he explained the system she had built from scratch. The executives nodded in approval. Keller clapped Clark on the back, praising him for exceptional leadership. She waited for someone to speak up. No one did. The next day, she was called into HR. The words were cold, rehearsed, and sharp as glass. You're not the right cultural fit. She tried to understand. Her performance was perfect. Her work spoke for itself, but the decision had already been made, signed off by Keller himself. As she walked out of the building that afternoon, the same marble lobby that had once felt like a gateway to her dreams now felt like the surface of a cage. The receptionist barely met her eyes. Security followed her out, ensuring she didn't linger. Outside, the sky had turned gray. She stood on the steps of the building, the wind cutting through her blazer, her heart heavy, but her spirit unbroken. She thought of her mother's hands, the ones that had pressed her clothes and whispered faith into her every morning. She thought of every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every dream she refused to let die. And in that moment, beneath the weight of humiliation and betrayal, something inside her hardened. It wasn't rage, it was resolve. Keller Dynamics had taken her dignity, but it wouldn't take her destiny. She turned away from the building without looking back, but in her mind she made a silent promise. One day she'd return, not as an employee, but as the one giving orders. And when she did, they'd remember her name. The weeks after her firing felt endless. Each morning, Amira woke to silence that pressed heavy on her chest, the absence of purpose gnawing at her from the inside. Her mother's words of comfort helped, but no encouragement could dull the sting of being cast aside, not because of incompetence, but because of who she was. For days, she replayed every moment from her time at Keller Dynamics, every condescending glance, every backhanded compliment, every stolen idea. Anger burned low within her like an ember, steady and patient. But anger alone couldn't rebuild a life. She needed a plan. With her savings dwindling, Amira took freelance engineering work, the kind that paid little but demanded much. She fixed industrial blueprints for small companies, wrote optimization code for struggling startups, even taught community college classes in mechanical design. Every night she studied the business world, not as an outsider, but as a student of power. While others rested, she learned. While others doubted her, she built quietly in the background. Years began to pass, and though the world didn't notice, a transformation was taking place. The fire that Keller had tried to extinguish now fueled her determination. Amira began developing her own concept, a clean energy module inspired by the very design she'd once created for Keller Dynamics. But this time, she built it her way. Sleeker, smarter, stronger. She spent long nights in her apartment, wires and circuit boards scattered across the kitchen table, her laptop glowing like a promise in the dark. Every test failure was met not with defeat, but refinement. Each success brought her closer to something extraordinary, a system that could convert solar energy at unprecedented efficiency, at a fraction of existing costs. Still, she needed funding. Banks turned her down, too risky, too new, to her. Investors smiled politely, praised her passion, then disappeared behind closed doors. But Amira had something more powerful than money: persistence. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening, while presenting her prototype at a local innovation fair, a quiet observer stood at the back of the small, dimly lit hall. His name was Victor Langston, a venture capitalist with a reputation for betting on visionaries others ignored. He watched as Amira, with worn hands and steady voice, explained the intricacies of her system to a handful of half-interested spectators. When the fair ended, he approached her booth. The conversation was brief, but the spark was immediate. He didn't see a struggling engineer. He saw a disruptor. Within months, Victor became her first investor. and with his backing, Aurora Energy Systems was born. The early days were brutal. Amira built her team from scratch, a small group of passionate young engineers, many of them people who had also been overlooked or underestimated by larger firms. They worked out of a cramped warehouse, powered by takeout coffee and relentless ambition. There were nights when the lights flickered from unpaid bills, when prototypes failed, when exhaustion blurred the line between genius and madness. But Amira's leadership never wavered. She led with purpose, empathy, and the kind of resilience that comes from having once been told you don't belong. Her vision was bigger than profit. It was personal. Aurora's first contract came from a small city initiative looking to reduce energy costs in low-income neighborhoods. The results were astounding. Amira's system cut power consumption by nearly 30%. Word spread quickly. Soon, Aurora Energy was being noticed by major players in the renewable sector. Investors began calling. Journalists wanted interviews. And slowly, the woman once dismissed as not the right cultural fit became a rising star. Within 5 years, Aurora Energy Systems became a leading name in sustainable engineering. Its innovations were praised globally. Governments sought partnerships. Competitors tried to imitate, but none could replicate the precision or passion that Amira poured into every design. She moved her company headquarters into a sleek downtown building, overlooking the same skyline that had once symbolized exclusion. Her new office faced directly toward Keller Dynamics, an unintentional yet poetic alignment. She often found herself gazing out of the window late at night, the city lights flickering below, her reflection overlapping the silhouette of her old employer's tower. It reminded her of how far she'd come, and how much further she still intended to go. But success, as she learned, brought its own shadows. Keller Dynamics had begun to decline. Their innovation pipeline had dried up. Their leadership, old and arrogant, failed to adapt to changing technology. Reports surfaced of layoffs, lawsuits, and financial instability. Then, one morning, an email arrived in Amira's inbox, a business merger proposal from a mid-tier investment group looking for partnerships with Aurora. Attached, buried deep in the proposal documents, was a name she hadn't seen in years: Keller Dynamics. Her pulse quickened. The investment group was seeking funding to buy out Keller's failing shares. In that moment, Amira realized something remarkable. For years, she had dreamed of revenge. But now, fate had quietly placed the opportunity in her hands. Over the next few months, she played her cards carefully. Through silent acquisitions and strategic partnerships, Aurora began purchasing Keller's declining stock, bit by bit, piece by piece. The world didn't notice. Keller didn't notice. But Amira was weaving a quiet web of ownership beneath their very noses. She studied Keller's finances, his board's weaknesses, his investors' fears. Every number, every asset, every debt was a thread she pulled until the fabric began to unravel. By the 6th year of Aurora's rise, Amira Carter, the woman once fired for not fitting the culture, was now the majority shareholder of Keller Dynamics. And with that, the company that had humiliated her now belonged to her. She didn't announce it publicly. Not yet. She wanted the moment to unfold perfectly. As she stood before the panoramic window of her office one evening, watching a rainstorm blur the skyline, she remembered the day she'd walked out of Keller Dynamics with nothing but pride and pain. Now, the same city that once ignored her bowed beneath her influence. But she wasn't finished. The true reckoning was yet to come. Next week, Keller Dynamics was holding its annual board meeting. And for the first time in history, the new majority owner, Amira Johnson, would attend. The morning of the board meeting arrived cloaked in silence, as if the city itself sensed that something monumental was about to unfold. A soft fog hugged the streets, muting the sounds of traffic and footsteps. In the distance, the skyline shimmered faintly beneath a pale sunrise. Inside her penthouse suite, Amira Johnson prepared for the day with quiet deliberation. There was no rush, no nervousness, only a calm, controlled anticipation that came from knowing destiny was finally within reach. The room was filled with light, the kind that revealed everything without harshness. Her assistant had laid out her outfit on a marble table. A tailored black suit with a subtle sheen, paired with gold accents that caught the morning glow. It wasn't armor in the literal sense, but it might as well have been. She wore it like a declaration. Power reclaimed, dignity restored. As she stood before the mirror, Amira saw not the woman who had once been escorted out of Keller Dynamics with her box of belongings, but the architect of her own empire. Every scar, every setback, had shaped her into this moment. By the time her car pulled up to the Keller Dynamics tower, the fog had lifted. The building rose tall but weary, its mirrored glass panels reflecting a company that had long lost its shine. Time had not been kind to it. The once bustling lobby now carried a dull hum. The air smelled faintly of coffee and desperation. Employees walked with the kind of hurried purpose that comes from fear, not ambition. The receptionist's smile was mechanical, the polished floors somehow colder. For a brief moment, Amira paused near the entrance, her eyes tracing the familiar marble pattern of the floor. She remembered standing there years ago, clutching her termination letter, the security guard hovering nearby. That memory had once haunted her. Now it only fueled her quiet satisfaction. No one recognized her at first. Years had transformed her. Confidence now lived in her every gesture. She signed in under a name that now commanded power. Amira Johnson, majority shareholder, Aurora Energy Systems. The staff's polite indifference shifted to hushed confusion when they realized who she was. A few whispered to one another, glancing up with disbelief as she walked past. She didn't need their acknowledgement. The weight of her presence spoke louder than any words. Upstairs, the boardroom waited. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath the sterile light. Framed photographs of past achievements lined the walls, moments frozen in time, each one a relic of pride. At the head of the table sat Martin Keller, older now, his once commanding posture dulled by fatigue. His hair had thinned, and the faint sag of his skin hinted at sleepless nights and unspoken worries. He looked up when she entered, expecting another investor, perhaps another critic. But as his eyes landed on her, confusion clouded his expression. Recognition took a moment, and when it came, it hit him, like a ripple of disbelief. The silence in the room thickened. Amira took her seat at the far end of the table, calm and composed. The other board members shuffled their papers nervously, uncertain of how to address her. The meeting began, routine and procedural, filled with financial reports and strained optimism. Keller tried to maintain his usual air of authority, but the undercurrent of tension betrayed him. When it came time to discuss restructuring and new investments, Amira's turn arrived. The head of finance cleared his throat, reading off the list of shareholders and their voting powers. Keller's face stiffened as he realized her name was listed at the top, not as a visitor, not as a partner, but as the primary owner. In that instant, the hierarchy inverted. Every word that followed was simply confirmation of what Amira already knew. She owned the company that had once discarded her. Keller Dynamics was now, quite literally, hers. The board murmured, their whispers filling the room like the sound of wind through brittle leaves. Keller's eyes flicked toward her, disbelief giving way to something raw, fear. He tried to speak, his tone wavering with forced politeness, but Amira's stillness silenced him more effectively than any interruption could. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't utter a word. Her power didn't need volume. As the meeting continued, she listened carefully, taking mental notes of the company's state, the debts, the missed opportunities, the outdated systems. Every failure, every crack in the foundation was a consequence of the arrogance that had pushed her out. By the time the meeting ended, the room felt lighter, not because the tension had lifted, but because the truth had settled. Everyone in that space understood what had changed. When the others began to file out, Keller lingered, staring across the table at the woman who now controlled his legacy. His silence was not noble, it was hollow. Amira gathered her documents with deliberate grace. She paused for a moment, glancing at the wall where the company's motto still hung. Innovation with integrity. The irony tasted almost bitter. As she left the boardroom, her heels echoed softly against the marble floor, the same rhythm she once followed when she walked out as an outcast. Now, it was the cadence of victory. Outside, the city greeted her with sunlight breaking through scattered clouds. She stood on the steps, inhaling deeply. It wasn't triumph she felt, not exactly. It was closure. But something inside her whispered that the story wasn't finished. Ownership was power, yes, but true justice would come only when the culture that had destroyed her was rebuilt from within. Back at her own headquarters, Amira called an emergency meeting with her executive team. She outlined her plan. Aurora Energy would merge Keller Dynamics into its structure, absorbing its assets, but transforming its ethics. Every policy that had once excluded people like her would be rewritten. The new company would be rebuilt in her image, inclusive, innovative, and unshakably fair. In the days that followed, the news broke across every major network. Aurora Energy acquires Keller Dynamics. Headlines screamed of disruption, of poetic irony, of history rewritten. Industry analysts called it one of the most dramatic reversals in corporate memory. Social media lit up with admiration. To many, she was a symbol, not just of success, but of redemption. But Amira didn't crave their applause. Her focus remained clear: to create something enduring, something that would outlast both her pain and her triumph. Still, deep within, she couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the man who had once called her unfit now answered to her decisions. The power dynamic had shifted completely, yet Amira's victory wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclamation. She had turned humiliation into legacy, and though she had conquered the empire that rejected her, she knew there was one final act left, a moment that would bring her journey full circle. In 1 week's time, Keller would officially step down. The company he built would pass entirely into her hands. And on that day, she planned to walk him through the same doors that once led her out. Only now, they would open for her. And on that day, she planned to walk him through the same doors that once led her out. Only now, they would open for her. The rain came before dawn, a steady whisper against the glass walls of Amira's office. It carried the metallic scent of renewal, washing the city clean in thin silver sheets. From her window, she could see the tower of Keller Dynamics across the avenue, its mirrored facade streaked and dulled, as if the weather itself were erasing its former arrogance. Today would mark the end of an era. By afternoon, Martin Keller would step down. Amira arrived early, before the lights of the building were fully awake. She walked the silent corridors of Aurora's headquarters, reviewing the transition documents once more. Every clause had been vetted, every signature verified. Legally, Keller Dynamics already belonged to her. Today was only the ceremony, the final bow before the curtain closed. Yet beneath the calm surface of professionalism, a quiet storm churned within her. Not hatred, something deeper. A reckoning between who she had been and who she had become. She remembered the woman who had left that company years ago, humiliated and uncertain. She remembered her mother's trembling hands, the ache of failure that had nearly broken her spirit. The memory rose like a ghost beside her, reminding her that power without reflection could become the same cruelty she once fought against. When the time came, she crossed the street on foot. No security detail, no entourage. Just her and the rhythm of her heels striking against wet pavement. Each step felt like an echo from the past returning to meet her. The lobby of Keller Dynamics greeted her with the same cold marble and sterile air as before. But the people inside moved differently now. Quiet, deferential, uncertain of how to treat the woman who had rewritten their future. Some nodded politely. Others looked away, afraid of what she represented. In the elevator, mirrored walls surrounded her reflection from every angle. The ascent felt slower than she remembered, as if the building itself hesitated to deliver her to the top floor. She watched the numbers climb one by one and let the weight of years settle in her chest. When the doors opened, the boardroom awaited, empty except for Martin Keller. He stood by the window, his back slightly stooped, hands clasped behind him. The skyline stretched beyond him like a fading kingdom. Age had softened the sharp edges of his presence. The man who once commanded rooms with icy confidence now seemed smaller, almost human. Amira entered quietly, placing her briefcase on the table. The rain tapped against the glass behind them, steady and unbroken. For a long moment, neither moved. Keller turned, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. The years had carved lines into his face, but pride still lingered there, a relic refusing to die. He gestured to the documents on the table, his resignation papers, already signed. His voice, hoarse from exhaustion, barely carried across the space. Amira didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke louder than any words could. In that silence, memory played itself out across her mind like an old film. The day she'd been fired, the echo of his words about cultural fit, the cold dismissal, the click of the security guard's shoes behind her. She had imagined this meeting countless times, rehearsed speeches of revenge, lines of righteous anger. Yet standing before him now, none of those fantasies seemed necessary, because he was already defeated. Keller's empire had crumbled not from external attack, but from the rot of its own arrogance. The system he had protected, the exclusion, the elitism, the quiet cruelty, had hollowed out everything he built. Amira hadn't destroyed him. He had destroyed himself. She opened the portfolio she carried and placed a single folder before him. Inside were plans for the company's rebranding, new name, new leadership structure, new hiring policies. The logo of Keller Dynamics would disappear within a month, replaced by a new identity that merged innovation with equity. Keller's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the folder, realizing what it meant. The legacy that bore his name would vanish from the skyline. For him, it was erasure. For her, it was liberation. Amira studied his face, searching for remorse. She found none, only confusion, perhaps regret for being overtaken, not for what he had done. And still, she felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only closure. She signed the final page, confirming receipt of his resignation. The ink bled slightly where her pen pressed too firmly, a small imperfection in an otherwise perfect document. She slid it toward him for acknowledgement. He hesitated, then nodded once. As she gathered her papers, she noticed a photograph on the shelf behind him. It was old, taken decades earlier, showing a younger Keller surrounded by engineers, all of them white, all smiling proudly beside a prototype engine. She remembered standing once in front of that same wall, her picture never taken, her contribution never recorded. Now she reached forward, removed the frame, and set it face down on the table. No words were exchanged. When she turned to leave, Keller spoke softly, his voice nearly lost beneath the rain. Whatever apology or justification he attempted dissolved in the space between them. Amira kept walking. In the hallway, the weight of the moment settled over her shoulders like a final test. Power could corrupt, yes, but forgiveness was not submission. It was freedom. By the time she reached the elevator, her reflection no longer looked like vengeance. It looked like peace. Back at Aurora headquarters, her team awaited her return. The transition ceremony had been scheduled for the evening, a symbolic signing, media presence, the unveiling of the new company identity. The auditorium filled with journalists, investors, and young engineers who had grown up watching Amira's rise. On the massive screen behind her, the new logo appeared, a luminous shape inspired by the aurora borealis, merging color and light, symbolizing progress born from diversity. When she stepped to the podium, the crowd fell silent. Cameras flashed. She looked out over the faces, different ages, races, backgrounds, all gathered to witness the rewriting of history. Her voice, calm and resonant, carried through the hall. She spoke not of revenge or triumph, but of renewal, of building a world where talent mattered more than appearance, where inclusion was not a quota, but a principle. She spoke of her mother, of every person who had been told they didn't belong. The applause rose slowly at first, then built into a standing ovation that filled the air like thunder. For the first time in years, Amira allowed herself to smile without restraint. Later, alone in her office, the city lights shimmered through the rain-slick windows. She poured herself a cup of tea, watching droplets trace lazy paths down the glass. Across the avenue, the sign that once read Keller Dynamics flickered, darkened, and then went out completely. A new sign would rise there soon, one bearing her vision, her values, her name. Amira exhaled softly, the tension of years melting away. The reckoning was complete, but her journey was not. Tomorrow would not be about revenge, it would be about creation. For every door that had once been slammed shut, she would build 10 more and leave them open. The morning after the ceremony felt different. The city woke beneath a veil of soft, golden light, and the skyline reflected new beginnings. From her office window, Amira watched the dawn settle over the towers, each one gleaming with a quiet hum of industry. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was staring at a world built by others. She felt like she was shaping it herself. The building that once bore the name Keller Dynamics now belonged to her. The new signage wasn't up yet, but the transformation had already begun inside. Walls once filled with portraits of old executives were now bare, awaiting fresh symbols of a different future. Gone were the stern eyes that had watched her years ago, silently reminding her she didn't belong. Soon that same space would celebrate innovators from every walk of life, a gallery of possibility, not privilege. The day was heavy with tasks. Meetings with department heads, transition memos, financial audits, lawyers, assistants, PR teams. The machinery of business churned endlessly, but beneath it all ran a pulse of excitement. Her employees, many of whom had quietly endured years of silent prejudice, now carried themselves differently. There was an air of relief in the corridors, a shared belief that the company could finally breathe. Still, Amira knew change wasn't about symbols or slogans. It was about structure, dismantling the quiet barriers that had been built into the bones of the system. She spent long hours in the boardroom, analyzing hiring pipelines, pay scales, and leadership diversity. What she found both saddened and motivated her. Departments where women and people of color were virtually absent, where promotions were locked behind invisible walls of networking and fit. She moved methodically but with heart. Each report became a blueprint for restoration. She launched mentorship programs, community partnerships, and initiatives to sponsor young engineers from underrepresented backgrounds. The media called it radical inclusion. She called it correction. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the tone of the company changed. Where fear once ruled, curiosity took its place. Meetings grew livelier, ideas bolder. Even those who had initially resisted began to see the shift as inevitable and profitable. The market responded favorably. Investors praised her vision. Awards and invitations began arriving at her desk, panels, think tanks, leadership summits. Yet Amira remained grounded, focused not on applause, but on purpose. Despite the progress, ghosts from the past still lingered. Some of the older executives who had served under Martin Keller viewed her transformation with quiet resentment. They sat in meetings, nodding politely while whispering dissent in corners. They missed the comfort of the old hierarchy, where people like them ruled unchallenged. Amira knew she couldn't win everyone over, but she didn't need to. Time and transparency would expose everything. One evening, while reviewing documents in the quiet of her office, she found an internal memo Keller had signed years ago. It was a simple directive about maintaining company culture. But between the lines, she saw it clearly, the coded language of exclusion. It had been that policy, she realized, that justified her firing. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the page, feeling the past brush against her fingertips like a chill. She could have destroyed it, burned it, and erased the proof of his bias forever. But instead, she archived it, not as evidence of pain, but as a reminder of what she had overcome. The document became part of a private collection she called The Record, a testament to resilience and evolution. One day, she thought, future leaders would look through it and understand how far they had come. By the end of the year, Aurora Innovations, the new name she had given the merged company, was thriving. The rebrand had not just revived business, it had reshaped the industry narrative. Media outlets hailed Amira as a visionary, a symbol of what leadership could look like when empathy met excellence. But amid the accolades, she remained introspective. Her success, she realized, was never just about revenge or vindication. It was about legacy, the kind that outlives anger and rewrites futures. She began visiting schools, universities, and community centers, speaking to young Black students about technology, innovation, and identity. In every room she entered, she saw versions of herself, curious, uncertain, hopeful. She told them her story not as a triumph, but as a roadmap, that even in the darkest systems, brilliance could not be erased. During one of those visits, she met a young woman named Jade, a mechanical engineering student who reminded her of who she had been at 24. Bright-eyed, ambitious, and quietly carrying the burden of doubt. Amira saw something in her, the same spark that once refused to die even when doors slammed shut. She offered Jade an internship on the spot, marking the beginning of something new, not just a mentorship, but a continuation. At Aurora, Jade thrived. She asked questions fearlessly, challenged conventions, and worked tirelessly on projects that pushed the boundaries of clean energy. Watching her, Amira felt a warmth that went beyond achievement. It was purpose-fulfilled. She understood then that true revenge wasn't destruction. It was creation, building something so powerful and just that the past no longer had the power to hurt you. Yet as she looked around the boardroom one afternoon, she realized that not everyone shared that vision. There were murmurs of discontent from certain shareholders, whispers that Amira's social mission was cutting into profits, that her diversity projects were more charity than business. She saw the same subtle expressions she had faced years ago, polite smiles concealing deep resistance. But this time, she wasn't alone. Her team, diverse and loyal, stood beside her. Engineers, managers, innovators, people who believed in her cause not because of obligation, but conviction. Together, they countered skepticism with results. The profits spoke louder than prejudice ever could. Still, the tension signaled a storm ahead, a reminder that progress was never permanent and power never uncontested. As night fell over the glass towers, Amira stood once more by her window, the city glittering beneath her. She thought of Keller, somewhere watching the company he built transform into something he never imagined. She wondered if he felt regret or only loss. It didn't matter, because her journey had moved beyond him. The next phase wouldn't be about dismantling the past. It would be about safeguarding the future. For every Jade who would follow, for every dreamer told they didn't belong, for every generation still waiting for their chance. Amira's story had begun with humiliation. It had continued with vengeance. Now it evolved into something larger, a movement. Outside, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, eternal. It tapped against the glass like a heartbeat, reminding her that the work was far from done. She turned from the window, the city's lights reflected in her eyes. The legacy she was building wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or erased. And tomorrow she would protect it, no matter the cost. Winter arrived quietly that year, blanketing the city in a hush of silver gray. From the 52nd floor of Aurora Innovations, the world below looked still, almost fragile. Snow gathered on rooftops, softening the hard lines of steel and glass that once defined power. Inside, the building hummed with warmth and life, engineers preparing product launches, teams collaborating across departments, voices blending in a harmony of purpose. The company had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What began as Amira's act of reclamation had become a revolution in itself, a living example that progress could be both moral and profitable. Investors were thrilled. The media called her the new face of corporate renewal, and universities taught her turnaround as a case study. But success had not made her complacent. Amira knew that every empire, no matter how noble, carried shadows. She still arrived early, walking the quiet halls alone before sunrise. It was her ritual, to feel the pulse of what she had built, to remember why she began. The silence reminded her that all of it, the power and praise, could disappear as easily as it came. That morning, as snow drifted against the glass, her assistant entered with a letter. It bore an unfamiliar seal but a familiar name, Martin Keller. The sight of it stilled her hand for a moment. She hadn't heard that name in nearly a year. He had disappeared quietly after signing away his legacy. No statements, no interviews, only rumors. Some said he had moved abroad. Others whispered of bankruptcy, illness, decline. Amira had never asked. She'd made peace with the silence. But now his letter lay before her. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was slow, deliberate, the kind of script that belonged to someone who had lived long with pride. He wrote of age, of regret, of the passage of time and what it reveals. He wrote that he wished to see her, not to contest anything, not to negotiate, but simply to talk. It would have been easy to ignore him, to let the past remain buried. But something in his words, a softness she had never known in him, stirred a quiet curiosity. A week later, she agreed to meet. They chose a small cafe far from downtown, tucked between brownstones and old trees heavy with snow. When she arrived, the air smelled of roasted coffee and winter spice. Keller was already there, sitting by the window, older now, thinner, slower, the years having carved humility into his face. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something that resembled weariness, maybe wisdom. He greeted her with a faint nod, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not hostile this time. It was reflective. The quiet shared between two people who had seen the same truth from opposite sides. Keller began to talk. His voice, once commanding, now trembled. He spoke of the years after his fall, the shame, the reflection, the isolation. How he had watched from afar as she rebuilt what he had broken. How he saw in her leadership not vengeance, but grace. He said he had come to understand the weight of his choices, not just toward her, but toward an entire generation he had shut out. Amira listened, not with anger, but with the calm of someone who had already forgiven long before the apology arrived. He told her he wanted to make amends, not with money or position, but with something else. He revealed that he had started a small foundation using what remained of his wealth to support minority students in engineering. He asked her to take it over, to guide it, to make it part of something greater. It was the last thing she expected. For years she had envisioned closure as victory, him gone, her ascendant. But this humble offering of redemption felt different. It wasn't about defeat anymore. It was about evolution. She accepted, not for him, but for what it represented. Transformation, continuity, the ability for something broken to become whole again. When they parted, Keller thanked her softly. Outside, the snow had thickened, falling in slow spirals that blurred the horizon. Amira stood in the cold, watching him walk away, his figure small against the white expanse, fading like a chapter closing in the distance. In the weeks that followed, she folded his foundation into Aurora's community programs. They renamed it the Phoenix Initiative, a symbol of rebirth through accountability. It became one of her proudest achievements. Students from all over the country began applying, their stories echoing her own. Talent overlooked, dreams deferred, potential unrecognized until someone believed in them. Jade, the young engineer she had mentored, helped lead the project. Watching her coordinate scholarship events, design outreach campaigns, and speak with conviction reminded Amira of how far the world had come, and how much further it could go. One evening, during the first Phoenix Gala, Amira stood on stage before a crowd of young faces filled with hope. Behind her, the Aurora logo glowed like a constellation. She spoke of resilience, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. She spoke of forgiveness, not as weakness, but as liberation. And then she spoke of legacy. Legacy, she said, was not about names on buildings or titles in newspapers. It was about the lives you touch, the doors you open, the voices you amplify when your own grows quiet. As she finished, the audience rose in applause that shook the room. Cameras flashed, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were on the students, on Jade, on the next generation, and she felt something deep and still within her finally settle. Later that night, after everyone had gone, she stood alone on the terrace overlooking the city. Snow fell again, whispering across the lights like a benediction. In the distance, she could just make out the faint glow of the old Keller building, now Aurora Tower, standing tall and renewed, a monument not to dominance, but to progress. The wind brushed her face gently, and she closed her eyes. Her story had begun in pain and ended in peace. Not every battle was fought to destroy, some were fought to rebuild. And hers, though born in injustice, had become a beacon for change. As dawn crept over the horizon, Amira turned back toward her office, the future waiting like an open door. Behind her, the city breathed, alive, awake, reborn.